Alright guys, back at you once again with another unique YouTube video. I've scoured the web and I haven't found anybody else doing this particular video anywhere. So, that being said, it used to be a 1990 Toyota 4Runner. That would be a second gen 4Runner. It has the 3.0 liter V6 3VZE fuel injected engine. And what we're going to do is turbo this bitch. So you might be thinking, well, why the hell are you doing the 3VZE? Those things are notorious for blowing head gaskets. Well, you know what? We need to clear up some confusion about that right now. Fact is, this one has never had a bad head gasket. The fact is, that one has never had a bad head gasket. How could this be? How could I possibly own two non-malfunctioning 3VZE V6 engines produced by Toyota? How is this possible? How? Because I don't fuck with the head gasket. The only reason the head gaskets go bad in these engines is because you have an untrained, ill-equipped mechanic screwing with the head gasket. That is the only reason these head gaskets go bad. I've never screwed with that head gasket, and I've never let anybody else do it either. That head gasket is perfect. This head gasket has never been screwed with, and it is perfect. There's nothing wrong with these damn engines. So with that all being said, let's go ahead and do what nobody else on all of YouTube has ever done before, and let's show you how to turbo this bitch. So, a few specs about this particular turbo. I'm not going to give you all the specs on it because, well, it's going to be a secret. I mean, hell, I'm putting this in a 3VZE. Who the hell does that? So, the only things I'm going to tell you about it is a 4-inch intake, 2.5-inch outlet, and a T4 flange. That's all I'm telling you about it. As you can see, I've already taken out the stock air box and I've moved my mass airflow sensor up here. I've taken a 45-degree angle hose, which is turbo specific. You want one that can hold up to the boost pressure, the air pressure on the inside. This is a 2 3/4 inch inside diameter hose. So if you're going to be copying what I'm doing, that's what you're going to need. We will go over what tools and whatever parts need to be purchased throughout the build. In order to minimize the build time, I've already taken off the hood, I've already taken off the grille, the bumper, the valance, and the fender. Now here on the driver's side of the engine, you've got the distributor here, mass airflow sensor, brake booster, and everything else. I'm going to try to fit the turbo right about here, right above the little fender well. Means I'm going to have to run the exhaust, run it coming up through here, which is going to be fun. In addition to all that, I'm going to try to keep my modifications to the truck as minimal as possible, but I am going to have to cut some holes going into my radiator support here on the front so that I can run the intercooler piping. Now, all of these parts did have to be purchased separately, such as the blow-off valve adapter tube, in addition to the blow-off valve, and the intercooler piping, in addition to the intercooler. Now, one of the cool things about this intercooler piping kit is that it did come with these little hose rings. So you might be thinking, well, why do I need this weird looking hose clamp? Why can't I just use a bigger one of these, you know, for like my radiator or whatever? The fact is, this is turbo specific. It is designed to hold up to the type of pressure I'm going to be putting this entire kit under. If you try to use one of these suckers, you're going to have a catastrophic failure. You're going to have stuff blowing up, popping loose, everything else is going to screw up the whole thing that you're doing. Plus, I plan on running 20 pounds of boost into that son of a bitch. Now, it may blow that engine up, but you know what? We're not going to know that until we do it, now are we? So if I do end up blowing this engine up, it won't matter anyway because I have an engine waiting in the wings that I can throw in here. So this one doesn't really matter that much, but we're going to find out how much pressure can you force into one of these before things do blow up in your face. Another piece of knowledge that you're going to need here is that 99% or more of all turbos that you buy are going to be what's called oil cooled. That means you're going to get kits like this and you're going to have to hook them up so that it actually pulls the oil from the engine into the turbo and then back into the engine. The only problem with this is that I don't know which ports in the engine actually feed oil out and accept oil back in. So what I'm going to do is drain the oil out of the pan. I'm going to bolt these directly to my oil pan, pop a couple holes in there, bolt them up and everything else, and run them up into the turbo. Now people say that this is for oil cooling, but the fact that I don't really believe that, I think it really has more to do with just keeping the turbo lubricated. Because, I mean, seriously, hot oil going into a hot turbo, I mean, how exactly are you cooling anything down? So, trying to call it oil cooled, that just doesn't make any damn sense. It just so happens that they do make a 3VZE specific turbo kit for this particular engine, but I didn't know about that until today, and I've already gone ahead and got a much better turbo than that kit had anyway. So I'm just going to piece everything together myself and see how it goes. But if you want to follow along with me and do everything that I'm doing, get the same parts that I have and follow the same things that I do, we're going to get our oil pan, we're going to get in there and start draining the oil. Now ideally what I would like to do, since it's oil cooled, what I'd like to do is run these steel braided lines down into my oil pan. The only problem with doing that is this is a 4-wheel drive. The axle's in the way, you got to go through a whole massive project just to be able to do that. So I need to find out which one of these bolts and everything else I can take off so that I can suck oil from the engine into the turbo and then back again. Now one of the ideas that I was having for the return line could be right here at the valve cover, right here where I have this little yellow vacuum plug. Originally this was your intake tube and it had this hose coming down into there. Well, it just so happened that the previous owner had about 4 quarts of oil too much in this thing, and it was squirting the oil up and going back into the intake. So obviously we can run a line to let our oil come back into here, but we need to also figure out where we're going to be drawing our oil from coming into the turbo. Because we can still use my original idea for the oil pan. We can thread this into a hole, we can just tap a hole into our valve cover and just bolt this thing onto there, and that'll let our oil come back into the engine. But we still need to find out where we're going to be pulling our oil from. One idea, maybe we can find a way to run this into our oil plug that's down there, our drain plug, for when you're pulling the oil out of the oil pan. Come up with some kind of a fitting or something that'll run into that, or maybe we'll come up with a different idea. If you had absolutely no other choice, my recommendation would be you bolt this up to your turbo on both sides, then you run the other end of your fitting to an oil cooler, essentially a miniature radiator or whatever, and then all you would do is you would just have this thing running constantly, circulating the oil through itself, through the braided lines, through the turbo, and through the oil cooler. It wouldn't actually connect to any other components. You would have to put an electric fan or something on your oil cooler so that it would constantly keep it cool, and the spinning motion of the turbo would circulate the oil. That would keep it lubricated, that would keep it essentially cool, if that is in fact what that is designed to do. But the only downside to trying to do that is that you would need some type of a reservoir somewhere in between these lines so that you'd be able to make sure that the oil isn't getting burned off, and you'd have to change it every now and then, just like you do a normal oil change for your engine. I mean, if you had no other choice, no other options, that would be an idea that you could go, that would be a route you could take, but I'm gonna see if I can find where I can take oil out coming out of the side of the block somewhere. But you know what? Here's another thing that tells me that oil cooling stuff is just a bunch of crap. Look how big that opening is on the side of the turbo. That's where the oil gets drawn in. There's the size of my finger. It's almost about the same damn size. But then when you order one of these kits with the steel braided lines, look at the opening down in there. It's a pinhole. Look how small that damn thing is. Should I take a drill to that? Should I drill it out and make it bigger? I mean, I'm wondering if that's even going to be able to pull oil through there. And this is supposed to be for cooling. Man, give me a break. I mean, I don't know who the hell they think they're fooling, but that ain't going to cool a damn thing. So I'm going to take a drill bit and make it just a little bit bigger. Now you tell me, which one of these do you think is more likely to lubricate and cool Now here's another way that you could run these hoses. I bought 2 of these kits, so each one of them came with one of these little connectors, and it came with one of the hoses and these little brackets and everything. So these brackets bolt onto each side of the turbo. What I can do is just run these into a junction, and then I'll have to run one of these hoses into the engine. Another thing you want to pay attention to is that you want to get 2 different types of these connectors, because on one side of the turbo is your intake and on the other side is your exhaust. Now I don't know which one is which, as this is my first turbo and first turbo application, but you can blatantly see that they are different, and for some reason the seller chose to send me a wrong hose, 2 equal hoses, and one of them doesn't bolt up. So I'm going to have to send that one back and wait for the replacement to arrive. So, no matter what route you decide to take with how you're going to run your oil lines, the fact is you are going to want to come underneath the vehicle and come up to the 14mm oil drain plug, and you are going to want to drain the oil. And that's because you're not going to be wanting any of this oil leaking all over the place once you decide where you're going to attach your fittings. You're not going to want to make a massive oil mess on the side of your block or down on your shop floor or anything once you finally do decide where you're going to attach those lines. So I believe I stated it earlier, this is not going to be a weekend project for me. I'm going to have to go through everything and make sure I work out all the kinks and everything, but one thing I was finding, I did pull the wiring harness out when I did the body swap and everything else, so my engine wasn't starting and I couldn't figure out what the problem was. And I accidentally came across the solution. I'm trying to move my coil and my igniter. That's what these 2 things are. They were originally right here on the driver's side of the engine. There's the brake booster. I tried to move them out of the way because I want to put the turbo here. The only problem is this has to be grounded. This bracket that this thing has actually has to be grounded. So make sure when you move that, to keep it away from the heat of the turbo, you're going to want to make sure that it is in some way or another going back to the negative of the battery. So now what I've done as a more permanent solution, I've moved my coil over here, mounted it to the bolt on the radiator, and then I zip tied the top because there's nothing to connect that to. And then that'll ground straight through the radiator, across the radiator support, and then into the wire that's coming from the negative post to the fender well over there. And another thing I did today was I ordered an oil filter relocation kit, and that's going to solve my problem of not having any hoses to run the turbo cooling or lubrication system, whatever the hell you want to call it for the turbo. What you're going to have to do is come down here underneath the alternator, which is on the driver's side of the engine. Underneath the alternator, right here is the oil filter. Just rotate that sucker counterclockwise. This thing right here. Rotate it counterclockwise till it comes off. That is if you're following the same things that I'm doing, buying the same parts and everything. And then we'll be able to run 2 hoses from that little sandwich adapter that goes in there, and then we'll be able to run those up to the turbo. And as I said, this is not a simple couple of day job for me, you know, this isn't some weekend project. I have to order those parts, and it's probably going to take up to a week for them to arrive. So now we're going to move on to making a little bit of a custom part here. I need to make some kind of a bracket, a plate to go right here, and that's going to look something like this. I'm going to cut out the center of this with a 2 1/4 inch hole. Once I get done cutting that out, I've got this 3-inch pipe here that I put a bunch of notches in. That'll allow me to hammer these edges in to make this a narrower end so that I can weld that over that hole. Now I did make a template for this. I'm going to make sure that I get that uploaded in the description so that if you guys decide to make one of these, you can make one of your own. I'm going to scan this rubber seal that originally came on it, and then I'll draw one up so that you can print it out on normal paper. Then you can trace it onto your steel, you can cut it out and do exactly what I'm doing. Now supposing that you don't have a bench vise, which I do, this little trick might help you out. When you're trying to cut a hole in it, and you don't have some way of keeping it still, use a big board, and then using nails or screws or something, you can put your plate on here. Because my drill is going to be traveling clockwise, all I have to do is position these on this side so that it doesn't want to spin in that direction. It will still spin this way, but I'm not cutting in that direction. That also makes it so that you can take it off if it gets too hot and starts to set the board on fire or something like that. And this will allow you to just stand on the board in order to steady it. And there you have it, an improvised bench vise. And that idea might also come in handy for when you have to drill these 4 holes. And speaking of those 4 holes, those are going to be about a 6mm or a 1/4 inch. So depending on what size drill bit you want to use. But just to be safe, I don't want to drill the hole too small, so I'm going to go with a 5/16. So you might be thinking, well, isn't it easier just to buy one of these rather than make it? Well, it's always been my experience that the things that I'm looking for can't be found. There might be something on eBay, there might be something on Amazon that you can get that'll be close, but I looked around on there, I didn't see what I was looking for or what I need, so it's always been my experience to just go ahead and make it. If you find one that works for your vehicle, for your engine, for your application, hey, good, great, go with it, but it's always been my experience that it doesn't exist and you're going to have to do it custom. And another thing about those intakes is that they're using such thin material. You have to remember, we're running a turbo into this thing. All this is going to be under pressure. So if we were going to get one of those off the shelf, purchasable ones, which just so happened to fit this 3VZE, I really don't think that thinner material is going to work under pressure. So making it myself, I know for a fact it's not going to be leaking. I know what materials it's made out of, and I know that I can weld it. If it's made out of aluminum or something, I can't use a flex cord welder on that, so it's just best to go with what you know. So as you can see here, I've started to crimp this in using my hammer. Now you want to remember, if you're doing this yourself, you need to make room so that when these bolts are shining through these holes, you're able to put those nuts on them and able to tighten this down. So when you weld this in, you want to make sure that you leave enough room to get those nuts on there. And again, this is function over fashion. I don't care how it looks. I don't care if the welds look like overlapping nickels or anything like that, because this is all going to be under my hood. Nobody's going to see this. Now, just in case you need this information for some reason, the thread pitch on these bolts that comes out of the mass airflow sensor is a 1.0 metric thread pitch. So here's my plan right now. Here's the driver's side of the vehicle, it's the front wheel. I'm thinking about cutting the exhaust here, and then I'm going to run my exhaust coming here, and I'm going to try to run it as close to the fender well as I can. I'm going to punch a hole coming up through here, and then I'll be able to bolt that to the exhaust flange on the turbo down here. The only thing that I'm seeing is that this is pointed in the wrong direction. Fortunately though, those are adjustable, so let's see if we can rotate it around. So I've loosened up these 6 bolts that are going around, and now I'm able to turn this independently. So this is the system that I've got going now. I've got my blow-off valve here, one of my intake tubes. I think it's called a charge pipe, I'm not sure about that. So I'm going to try to run that going up into that pipe, and then I'm going to run this hose going over to here, and then it looks like that's pretty much how it's going to be working right now. Plans and setups may change as I progress in this, but one thing I was noticing is my brake booster might actually have a problem here, because if I'm forcing all of this air pressure into the engine, it's going to come back through that tube, and that might screw with my brake booster. And now you have 2 options of what you can do there. So one of those ideas is that you take this off of your intake and you plug this up, and then you take an electric brake booster and you hook it up to that hose over there. It's basically an electric motor that pulls a vacuum. The only problem with those things is that they run about 125 bucks. Option number 2 is you get yourself a little fitting, maybe a barbed end on one end and threaded on the other. And then what you're going to do is you're going to run this hose all the way over here to this end of your turbo where the air is going into it. You just tap a little hole right here, you thread that sucker in, and what it's going to do is it's going to pull the air, it's going to pull a vacuum as it's pulling air into the turbo. You don't want to put it, say, over here where this is building up boost pressure and pushing the air out. You don't want to tap it in here, you don't want to tap it in here. The only place you're going to be able to do that is at the beginning of your turbo. So back to work. Down here on the fender well, I've cut this little piece out using my reciprocating saw, also known as a sawzall. I've also cut through my exhaust right there, and I'm going to be running a pipe essentially like this. This is a 2.5 inch diameter pipe. I believe this is a 2-inch pipe coming out of the engine. So there will be some fitment issues, but that's where weld comes into play. So I've been struggling with this little problem for the past day. I'm starting to strip out that bolt right there on the far side. I cannot get this damn exhaust to come off. So I've got two choices. I can either hope like hell I can get those 3 off and then unbolt it from this side of the engine and take this whole manifold off, or I can cut that exhaust so that I can get to that nut and get it off of there. And since I've been screwing with this for a day now, I've already lost my patience, so I'm gonna go with the this exhaust can kiss my ass route. And with that cut out of the way, I now have the ability to get a socket on there. So now that I got this off of there, you can see it does have a slight curve to it so that it can go out the back of the vehicle. What I'm gonna do is I'm going to turn that now so that it starts to curve out toward this way. And that'll keep my bend from being too sharp, which will restrict the flow of air. So you want to keep your bend as smooth as possible, and if I turn that, that'll help me do that. And that'll really come in handy when I go to put this exhaust back on when it's all done, because I'll be able to get my socket on there easily now to put the nuts back on to hold the exhaust in place. And in trying to tighten one of them up, I found that it was loose, and I really don't know any way of tightening those things in place so that they don't come out. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead with a normal bolt. And just in case you need this information for anything, this is a standard Toyota bolt, 10mm with a 1.25 thread pitch. And just in case you need this information as well, it's about 1.5 inches long. You can get one that's 1.25 inches, maybe even 1 inch, because when you tighten these all the way down, you still have about maybe 1/4 inch of thread showing after you tighten this all the way down. And another modification I'm going to do, I'm going to take my tin snips, I'm going to run along this little line here of dirt, that way I can get my hands back in there so I can access them bolts. So I've pretty much decided that my exhaust is going to come up right here, so now I need to cut this out. Now just in case you were wondering, I did not bend these exhaust pieces myself. I went to my local muffler shop and bought a couple of scrap pieces they had laying around. So now for the exhaust flange, I'm taking 2.5 inch tubing, and I'm going to put a couple of cuts in this thing so that I can move this tube out to try and fill up that entire square. And then it starts to look like this. I'm going to show you some of my progress here. If you ask me, I think it's turning out pretty damn awesome. So I went ahead and drilled a 3.5 inch hole down there for the outlet of the turbo. So I've got this rubber hose put on there now. Started the bend so I can come out the front. Back to what I was saying earlier about this being too close to the distributor cap, what I'm going to do about that is a turbo blanket. And this will help to keep your paint that's on your hood from getting all bubbled up and cracking and everything else from the extreme heat, and it'll keep your wires from getting melted and causing fires underneath here. Going with a turbo blanket's just an easier method than trying to go with, say, fiberglass header wrap or something and trying to wrap it around the turbo. It's just easier to do this. I mean, this was only like 35 bucks. So I don't have anything hooked up. I don't have the air hose going to anything. I don't have the exhaust hooked up. But I want to fire this thing up and see if I can hear what it sounds like. And I suspect that my fuel pump has gone out because I didn't hear it come on, which could help to explain why it died right after it started. So now in order to complete this, I'm going to take this big long piece here, 90 degree. I'm going to cut that hole out, and then that's going to go right in there. Alright, that was a fun project. So when I fit that all the way up in there, that will line up. And for the record, putting this pipe onto the turbo, this little rubber hose, putting that thing up onto that fitting was a pain in the ass. Even though it's a 2.5 inch hose and a 2.5 inch outlet on the turbo, I had to use some soapy water, just like in my tire patch video. And if you spray it on the inside of here and if you spray it on the outside there, it definitely does make a difference trying to get those things on. Now I know I have a tendency to jump around from thing to thing, but a little bit of a scatterbrain, I guess. But this is your 3-inch V-band clamp, and that is for the back of the exhaust here, the exhaust port on the turbo. So I'll probably have to pound this down or cut it out or something like that and make a little bit of room for it. But you want this end, this lip here, that's going to make contact with the turbo, and then you've got this groove that goes inside the clamp, and what you do is you fit both of those inside of there, and then you clamp it down just like you do with your hose clamps here for the intake tubing. And then on the other end of the flange, this little connector, I don't remember what the hell it's called, but what we're going to do is we're going to take our tubing. This is a piece of 3-inch tubing that fits right inside that sucker. So what we do is we just weld that in place, and then we run our exhaust going out the back of the vehicle. And with a little bit of persuasion of the hammer perspective, I was able to give me just enough room to fit that down in there. So in keeping true to my secret project, I'm trying to figure something out here. I'm trying to figure out if I want to run this pipe, go in through the firewall and try to shimmy it up through here somehow, and then go into this pipe and go across and then go in. Or I can take this pipe and put it down here under the valance maybe. I really want to hide it, so I might, if I'm lucky, I might be able to fit that thing in there somehow, all the way across, and then go up. I mean, if you wanted to, you could probably just take out the headlight and run your hose going up through there, but I mean, this is going to be my daily driver. I plan on driving this thing down the street, going to get groceries, all that other shit, so what I think I'm going to go with is running it just above the intercooler, right in front of the radiator. I'm going to have to cut this on the line that I made. I'm going to put that right there so that it doesn't interfere with that headlight. So I cut that off. Another thing I'm going to do is I'm going to cut along here so that I have a little bit of room to tuck this underneath this bracket going across here. So once again, I'm running into fitment issues, so I think what I'm going to have to do is cut these little tabs off of the top of the intercooler while remembering that there is a radiator right behind that sucker, and I've got to use my reciprocating saw. Man, that was a pain in the ass. Alright, so we're going from the turbo all the way across, we're coming back again. I'm going to take that piece that I cut off of that 180 degree bend over there, I'm going to put that there, and I'm going to remove this radiator overflow, and I'm going to run this hose just going straight down to the ground. Man, quite the project this thing is turning into. Let me show you. Got my blow-off valve sitting right there, so that I can have that coming right out the front. I only got a couple of more little bends to go. I'm thinking I'm gonna cut this short, like about here, and then I'll be able to have this coming up over this end. And then when I cut it about here, then I can just run maybe a 180 silicone hose or something right into there. So now it's time for the finishing touch. I didn't really think that running red piping was going to be an issue because I didn't know that I was going to be running it right behind the grill. I figured anybody looking through my grill or looking underneath the body or something trying to figure out what's under there is going to see something red and be like, well, what the hell's that? But since it's running behind the grill, I need to get this and fix that issue. Intercooler, blow-off valve. What the hell are you talking about? It's just a Toyota. I don't see anything. You see any intercooler in there? I don't see any intercooler. Now this particular project took all damn day. And as you can see, I did kind of make a mess of things. First I had to run the pipe going down and going underneath the cab and everything. But yeah, I'm gonna have to take a bunch of those pieces that I cut out of here and try to patch all that up. I was able to run my return line, the one that's bigger than the intake line. There's that small one we were talking about earlier. I got the bigger one coming through here and going down and around. And when that sandwich adapter plate arrives, I'm going to stick that right down there where the oil filter was, which is right there. And that's how I'll be oil feeding. So, other than that, gotta cut this tube, put that 180 on there, and bolt that flange back on there. Which by the way, these V-clamp turbo flanges are shit. When this thing just falls off after you touch the damn thing. So just a weak little spot weld on those. Not very good for quality control, but I gotta bolt that all back on there, and then my exhaust will be completely done. So I had to take a couple of days to figure some stuff out. It looks like my original idea of using a 45 degree up here for this 2 3/4 inch pipe, the silicone hose, it looks like that's not going to actually work out. The original idea that I had, this pipe was going to come up 90 degree over, come over 180 degree on top of the turbo, and then go in. There's just too many bends with all of that and everything, so I'm going to have to do something else. The only problem with doing that is that it's coming this way, it's going around. You're restricting the airflow by making the air run through this whole serpentine of, you know, this basically a crazy straw of tubing all the way into the intake. And it's just more efficient if you have it running pretty much straight into the intake as quickly as possible. So that's what I'm going to try to do. I'm going to try to just curve this straight over, going straight in, put this here. So I've ordered a 90 degree for there. I can cut that short if I have to, if I need it something closer to a 45 or, you know, maybe a 60 or a 70 degree, whatever it ends up being. So I'll put this here, and then I will cut this tube, which is a 2.5, and then I'll cut this wherever I need it to in order to line up with this. So another problem I'm having is when I try to close the hood, this hose is pointed up too high and it's lifting up this part of the hood. So I can correct that by loosening up these bolts that are going around the turbo on this side. I believe there's 1, 2, 3, looks like 6 of them. So you loosen up those 6 and then you can rotate the housing on this side. So let's say for a second you find yourself in a situation similar to mine, where you need to rotate the center without rotating the intake or the exhaust. You're going to need to loosen up these 6 bolts, and then you're going to have to loosen up these 6 bolts once again. So as you can see, I was able to rotate it a little bit, and I also turned this hose now so it's tucked under the fender. So now it's not going to be sticking up and stopping my hood from closing. Make sure you tighten down all 12 of those bolts again. Throw your turbo blanket back on there. So while I'm waiting on that hose to arrive and while I'm waiting on the oil filter relocation kit, What I'm going to do now is install my electronic boost controller. Now to start doing that, what I'm going to do is connect this silicone hose all the way down here to that fitting right there at the end of my finger on the end of this turbo intake tube. So now what we're going to do is cut this hose in the middle so we can put our electronic boost control solenoid in there. So here's how that looks. It didn't say what to do with port number 3, so I just put a bolt in there to plug it off. So I'm just going from number 1 to number 2. So now I've got the boost controller set up in here on the dashboard. I'm not allowed to show it to you because it's got their logo plastered all over it and they're not sponsoring me. So what I'm going to do, instead of just hooking this thing straight up to the positive and the negative of the battery, what I'm going to do is run it to a toggle switch. That way only I know how to turn it on and off. That way if somebody steals my car, they won't be able to drive it properly. So as per the instructions on the electronic boost controller module, the little computer box, there's a little vacuum hose coming out of it. I'm going to run that through the firewall and into an existing vacuum line that's going into the engine. And I'm really hoping that this isn't the case, but I do have a lot of vacuum lines going into this thing. So again, if it is necessary, I will probably have to make an extension for that air filter so that I can run all of these tubes so that they have an actual vacuum being pulled into them. And that might actually explain why nobody's ever tried to turbo one of these damn things before, why there's no YouTube videos or anything. I haven't even seen a damn YouTube video of one of these things running with a turbo attached to it, let alone having somebody show you how to put a turbo into one. So this whole damn project might be for naught if I can't do something with those vacuum hoses. In any event, it doesn't matter for me because, like I said, I'm going to run this sucker as much as it'll hold until it blows up because I've got another engine I can throw in here, and then I'm going to turbo that sucker. So we'll just have to write this one up to another very poorly written product installation manual. But it doesn't specify whether or not this needs to actually be a vacuum that's going into that control box, or if it's only going to be sensing when there's pressure coming through that line, or if I'm going to actually have to pull all of those hoses off and make sure all those vacuum lines, including that one coming out of the box, is going straight over in front of the turbo so it's actually drawing a vacuum. So that's one thing that we're going to be finding out, whether or not that thing is trying to sense a vacuum or whether or not it's trying to sense overpressure that's inside the engine. Maybe, I don't know. Because there is something that's actually written in the instruction manual. It talks about overboost, which is so that you don't force too much pressure into the engine. Maybe that's what that's for, maybe, or maybe not. I have no idea. We're going to wait and find out. But in any event, I've run that hose coming through the firewall, coming over to here into my number star hose, which is coming into this triple port right here next to the cold start injector. And just in case anybody out there needs this information for anything, if you've pulled your hoses out or whatever and screwed anything up, number star goes to the upper left, the number 1 goes to the upper right, the one on the bottom is the number 2. The number 4, which is down here, is coming down to your EGR system. I believe that's what that is down there. Number 3 is coming to this top hose. Number 5 is on the left, down there. And the number 6 is on the right. And the more I'm looking at this, the more I'm thinking that that is going to become a damn issue. I've got the brake booster, then I've got the vacuum hoses that go to the 4-wheel drive. All of that's going to have a vacuum. So I'm probably going to have to make a 4-inch tube because the odds that I find a 4-inch tube that I can put in here are staggered against me. So filter's going to be about here, have a 4-inch tube here, and then just have a big old hose coming off of that sucker going over, and then I'll just run all those vacuum lines into each other right there where they're at. So that'll be about a 2-inch long piece of pipe that I'm either going to have to find or make, and I'm not going to be able to do that today because the day's almost over and all the stores are closed. So this is where I'm at today. I've made my 4-inch adapter piece for my vacuum hose. I don't even want to screw around with it and just hope that it's, you know, not going to screw anything up. So I'm just going to go ahead and run all these vacuum lines. I got all these adapters and everything for it. So, and it's just a standard 4-inch tube with, I think it's 0.65 wall and a 1/2 inch outside diameter barbed connector fitting with a little nut on it, hollow all the way through so that it pulls a vacuum, and that's going to go right there. So now here's what that looks like all done. I am going to put a hose clamp on here even though it's going to be pulling a vacuum, so I shouldn't have to worry about that hose coming off, but just in case the vibrations of the engine, I'm going to make sure I got that hose clamp on there. I'm going to run that line coming over, and then I'm going to cut it wherever, and then I'm going to run all my vacuum attachments. Finally, after so much time, I now have my hoses run. We're going from the blow-off valve straight up and through our mass airflow sensor, curving around and in. Now, as for the oil filter relocation kit, it looks like it's still caught up in customs in the next state over, so I don't know if I'm going to get it before this weekend, which is going to force my hand, and I'm going to have to use these connectors to run into the steel braided line so that I can just run a self-circulating oil system until it does arrive. That'll at least allow me to go do some racing this weekend. Well, this was an unbelievable goddamn mess. Since it doesn't look like my oil filter relocation kit is going to be arriving anytime this week, I had to run these lines and I had to fill them both up with oil and then try to connect the two hoses before the oil ran out of them. And that ended up making a big old friggin' mess. If you want to save yourself some trouble, the assholes that make these hoses, make sure there is a swivel connector on each end of them so that you can actually tighten them down without the hose turning with it. This end, which goes into the turbo, has that swivel connector on it, but the other end does not. Which means apparently they expect you to tighten that end in first into your engine, and then come over here and then tighten this one onto the turbo. I had to do it the other way around. They were a bad company for not foreseeing that potential possibility, and now I've got a crimped steel braided line, and probably barely even filled with oil, but hopefully I shouldn't have to run this thing for more than a few days being like that. But that's all done. Now I'm going to run the vacuum hoses. I'm going to fill this thing up with oil, and that should be it. So first test fire with the turbo all set up. Boost pressure is at 0 using my electronic boost controller. My fuel pump isn't coming on. So I've determined that my fuel pump was working, now it's not, and it's not an electrical problem. It's not that the pump has gone bad because it was working, and I've got no power going through the line. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run a jumper wire straight from my battery through a toggle switch to that blue wire coming out of the fuel pump. So now I've spliced the wire. So as soon as I touch this wire, I should hear the fuel pump. And I do. So I will run that permanently through a toggle switch. Okay, so key on. Okay. Boost controller on. And fuel pump on. Here we go. So anyway, there you have it, guys. I hope this video has been educational for you. I believe it is the first ever video depicting the install of a turbo into a Toyota truck. So I hope it has been educational for you guys, and if you decide to do it, you can either do the same thing I did or do it differently with any of the suggestions that I've given you along the way. Now again, all of these parts did have to be purchased separately. I have my aluminum blow-off valve adapter. One thing I was noticing is my brake booster does work. As I was saying,